The one artist that I feel could be my brother is Franz Kafka. I really dig him a lot. On January 15th, 2025, the great director David Lynch passed away. There will never be another David Lynch movie. Sadly, this also means that there is one particular project that will never see fruition, a David Lynch movie adaptation of Franz Kafka's most famous short story, The Metamorphoses. However, that doesn't mean Lynch's existing filmography doesn't teem with themes that are also present in Kafka, and in my opinion, the same methods of interpretation that apply to Kafka also apply to Lynch, to the extent that we can say that Kafkaesque and Lynchian are almost synonyms. We'll come back to that in just a minute. It's well known that Lynch was heavily inspired by Kafka and by The Metamorphoses in particular. Henry, the hero of Eraserhead, gets into Kafka's world a bit. Henry is very sure that something is happening, but he doesn't understand it at all. This video is not going to be a deep analysis of either Kafka or Lynch. In fact, the main point I want to make is to let these works speak for themselves, and letting the art wash over you, so to speak, without trying to read things into everything. That doesn't mean there are no deeper layers to these works. There are many, but it does mean that at least on first viewing, it's probably best to just let the images, whether those are Kafka's sentences or Lynch's film shots, speak for themselves, and letting them sit in your subconscious for a while. So this video won't be a deep dive, but rather a sort of tribute to Lynch, and above all, a call to action to go watch his movies, and if you have some time left, read some Kafka. There are many parallels between the worlds created by these two men, and a deeper dive into the specifics can be the subject of a future video. This video, however, is more about what I see as a key of interpretation to enjoy this art. So, before we go on, let's quickly revisit Kafka's classic novel. Gregor Samsa awakens one morning to find himself transformed into a giant insect. Despite his new physical state, his first thoughts are of his job as a traveling salesman. He worries he might be late to the office. Not that he likes his job. In fact, he hates his boss and the ephemeral nature of the traveling salesman's life. It doesn't fulfill him. But he is the sole breadwinner of the family, working to pay off his father's debts, and that makes quitting an impossibility. So, stuck in his new insect body, Gregor struggles physically, unable to get out of bed. His boss arrives to scold him for his absence, and upon hearing his incomprehensible sounds, the boss and Gregor's family experience shock and horror when Gregor finally opens the door and reveals his new appearance. His father aggressively forces him back into his room and injures him in the process. With Gregor's transformation, the family's financial security is threatened, leading them to isolate him further as they adjust to new roles. His mother and sister, Grete, start working. Grete initially cares for Gregor, feeding him food he can now only stomach if it's rotten, but her compassion fades over time. She starts to clean out his room, and Gregor is in two minds about this, unsure of what this means, both for his family and for himself. He tells himself that, on the one hand, the furniture being gone from his room would be a good thing, as it's clearly of no use to him in his insect form, and it would give him more space to crawl around in the room. But on the other hand, he fears that this process might speed up something that had been happening already, the process of Gregor forgetting his own humanity, and, in tandem with that, his family also forgetting his human origins. Gregor finds this thought deeply distressing, and he tries to communicate in vain that there is still humanity left in him, especially when he tries to protect a cherished picture, a portrait of a woman on his wall. But this episode is enough to freak out his mother completely. She faints, and things spiral out of control even more than they had already. Chaos ensues. Ultimately, after Gregor is severely injured by an apple thrown by his father, his health deteriorates. The family, always in need of money, rents out rooms to lodgers, keeping Gregor's existence a secret. But one evening, attracted by Grete's violin playing, Gregor emerges, only to be discovered by the lodgers, who then demand to leave without paying. Grete, frustrated and no longer seeing Gregor as her brother but as a burden, insists that they must get rid of it. Understanding his place, Gregor returns to his room, where he dies of starvation. His body is discovered by a cleaning lady who disposes of it. His family, relieved, takes the day off to go for a walk in the countryside, discussing moving to a smaller apartment and contemplating Grete's future marriage prospects, signaling relief, and they return to normalcy without Gregor. If we try to imagine this story as a movie, the fact of the matter is that not much would be happening on screen. There's a family, an apartment, and an insect. And the insect is scurrying about a bit. The family acts shocked, it gets wounded, and it dies. The strength of the story lies not in what is happening in the external world. It's not a story about a cockroach. It's the story of a man who is turned into a monstrous vermin. It's about his interior life, his thoughts, his worries, his alienation from the world and those he loves, and how they start to treat him differently over time. In other words, it's a psychological novel, and it's hard to imagine how one might put this onto the screen without losing its essence. And indeed, at one point, Lynch seriously considered adapting the novel for the big screen and even wrote a script for it. In interviews at the time, he seems to say the project could never happen because creating the insect, special effects-wise, would be too expensive, and he expresses the hope that later in time, with computer technology sufficiently advanced, doing it might become cheaper, and thus the project might become viable. But later on, Lynch seems to realize the fundamental problem with trying to turn the Metamorphoses into a movie. It's simply not the type of story that lends itself to a visual medium. The novel and the movie speak two different languages, and it's best to leave them both untranslated. Once I finished writing the script for a feature film adaptation, I realized that Kafka's beauty is in his words. That story is so full of words that when I was finished writing, I realized it was better on paper than it could ever be on film. So it was doubtful in the first place that we would ever see a David Lynch Kafka movie. But sadly, now it's a certainty. That doesn't mean that the existing David Lynch filmography is devoid of Kafka's influence. In fact, metamorphosis or transformation of some kind plays a major role in many of his films, as well as themes of doppelgangers and just the general surreal, dark, gloomy, mysterious atmosphere that we've collectively decided should go by the name of Kafkaesque. This video is not meant to be an analysis of the Metamorphoses. We will release a full, longer, dedicated video on that subject if there is enough interest. And if so, please leave a comment. This video is also not an analysis of any of David Lynch's movies. In fact, if you've never seen a David Lynch movie, I recommend you watch them first, before looking up any discussion on them whatsoever. Try to go in as pure-minded as possible, without any preconceived notions of how they should be interpreted. Because here's the thing, it's the same surreal, dark, gloomy, mysterious atmosphere in Kafka's novels and in Lynch's movies that also lends to them this air of there being something incomprehensible about them. And that, in turn, creates a desire to explain. Entire libraries have been written on the interpretation of Kafka's work. Researchers have desperately pored over his extant writings, any writings, from grocery shopping lists to the writing he did for his day job, all in search of the one clue, the holy grail that would serve as an explanation for his work, to unravel the mystery of Kafka's universe. Kafka's works have been the subject of countless literary studies. His best friend, Max Brod, saw in all of Kafka's work a religious allegory. Later came the Freudians and an almost compulsive obsession with Kafka's love life and the relationship he had with his father. And then there is the Marxist interpretation of his works, the existentialist one, the postmodern one, the meta-narrative one, as many interpretations as there are readers. And the same holds true for Lynch's movies. The atmosphere in these films is so surreal that there isn't much to grasp onto, at least not on first viewing at least. And Lynch was very open about letting the viewer decide which interpretation he likes. In my humble opinion, the same holds true for Kafka as for Lynch. That is, you should just enjoy these works and resist the temptation to seek meaning and unravel the symbols. Our minds are meaning-making machines, and when we are faced with strange images or interrupted patterns, or even random noise, we cannot help but try to find a meaning into it. But maybe meaninglessness is the point. It's my opinion that Kafka didn't have a large, overarching narrative in mind when producing his works. Each work, even though they share similar themes, stands on its own and should be judged on its own merits. The surrealism in these works is just that, surreal, something beyond ordinary reality. It's art in its purest form in the sense that it offers us an escape from the world, even for just a little while. If you read the Metamorphoses for yourself, and if you're a little bit familiar with the infamous dry humor of the Germans, you'll find a lot of funny passages in there. Kafka himself reportedly laughed out loud while reading the work to friends and family. That hardly fits with the image we have created of Kafka in our heads, of the brooding, melancholic, misanthropic writer of labyrinthine bureaucracy and existential darkness. The point is, rather, that these artworks should be enjoyed as they are, without us trying to add extra layers to them. Sometimes a phrase is just a phrase. Like a Dali painting that is completely devoid of meaning and symbolism, but simply presents a pretty picture for us to look at. If it's your first time reading Kafka or watching Lynch, I highly recommend you simply let the works wash over you. Don't obsess about trying to read into things. Let the images, sentences, shots just enter your mind. Sleep it over, let the work marinate in your mind, and then maybe watch it again later with fresh eyes. When engaging with these artworks, there is a stubborn part of your rational mind that is trying to find meaning in the patterns, when the whole point of surrealist, absurdist art is often that it simply draws on subconscious imagery that defies rationalistic explanation. And often, whatever lies subconscious will lie there for a while, until, in due time, it comes to the forefront. But this really cannot be forced. In a way, it devalues the art if you try to engage with it from a rational, explanatory point of view. So the search for interpretation and meaning is often a fool's errand, and perhaps that's just the point. Some art is not meant to be explained, but experienced. And life is for the living, and is meant to be lived. So if I can leave you with a recommendation or two, get yourself a copy of the Metamorphoses, read it, absorb the imagery, let it sit with you for a while, and then watch Lynch's Eraserhead and Mulholland Drive and do the same thing. It's probably what Lynch would have wanted. Thank you for watching, and we'll see you in the next one. And of course, a thank you to our Patreons for their support of the channel. There are more book reviews and maybe movie reviews coming up on there for patrons, and of course there's a backlog of patron-exclusive content on there on Nietzsche and Schopenhauer. Take a look over there and support us if you can afford it. And again, thank you for watching.